Good afternoon, Bradford, and good afternoon. Wow, this is really, and unsurprisingly, an amazing audience. Good to see you all. My name is Professor Saeed Khan. It is my pleasure to be chairing this particular panel on cancel culture and culture wars with, my voice keeps changing. I haven't had this happen since I was 12. Two people who I think certainly not only are expert in the field, but their experience really helps pretty much shape the narrative on this particular topic. We are joined with the author of currently, this is only the beginning, The Making of a New Left, From Anti-Austerity to the Fall of Corbyn, Michael Chessum. For those of you who are not familiar with Michael's work, he's a journalist and activist who's been on the front line of the New Left movements of recent years. He co-founded the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, playing a very prominent role in the 2010 student protests and the anti-austerity movement that followed. When Momentum was created, he was elected to its first steering committee and served as its treasurer. I almost had it put down as treasure, which I don't think would have been wrong either.
No, he absolutely did.
Not many people would agree with that.
That's exactly the point where the fountain pen ran out of ink. Worked as the press officer and speechwriter on Jeremy Corbyn's second leadership campaign. He's a national organizer for left-wing and anti-Brexit group Another Europe is Possible. But he also became a dissident within Corbynism and a prominent voice in the public debate on Brexit and migrant rights. Joining him is the author of the current book, Minority Rule, Adventures in the Culture War. And by the way, both Ash and Michael will be available after this session for book signings. Excellent. Ash, as many of you know, is a British journalist, academic, and activist, the senior editor at Novar Media, and she writes and speaks extensively on race, class, feminism, and colonial history, and engaging media presence. I want to lean into this phenomenon of culture wars. How many of you are familiar with the term culture wars? Okay, excellent. So what I think we could probably do is ask each of you for a definition of culture wars, and also along with that, I'd like your opinion on when the first shot was fired in this war. Michael.
Well, I think there are a number of different ways to look at this. I think that what we've had is the collapse of a neoliberal consensus, and we've had a collapse of the centre, and we've had a collapse of ruling class ideology. And the political and economic establishment has lost permission to rule. It's lost permission to govern. It no longer has the maths. It no longer has the votes to deliver electoral majorities for austerity, privatisation, balancing the books on the backs of the poor, all that stuff. And it's had to seek a different bit of an electoral coalition. And it's had to find a narrative to explain why people's lives have got worse for decades and decades and decades. And I think when you look at Trump, when you look at Brexit, when you look at the mainstream ideology that is now coming out of our political class, the answer is migrants and foreigners. But there's a whole cloud of potential villains, and it's a never-ending list of identities that you can pull out and stretch out, and you can always find scandals, and you can always find something silly. Basically, the culture war as we now find it is an attempt to legitimize a political system that is making everybody's lives worse. And it is profoundly dangerous. I think we are on the cliff edge of something very, very dark indeed when it comes to the kind of authoritarianism we're seeing and to the kind of attacks on our rights that we're seeing. And so for me, the culture war that we're finding ourselves concerned with is an attempt to undermine what we should be fighting, which is a class war. And I think there are all kinds of ways to frame that, but fundamentally the dividing line is still class. That's not to say that liberation of all kinds isn't important. And I think it's important as well that the left does not abandon, doesn't simply say this is all a distraction. I think that there are elements of the culture war when it comes to migrants' rights, which are not just, for instance, which are not just about, a nice additional extra, but really are a core part of ruling class ideology. They're a core part of justifying our exploitation and of justifying the political system that we now find ourselves up against.
It's really interesting because in the American context, class is usually not the lens through which issues are really deployed. It's more about race. But I see the parallels that are there because when you talk about migrants, when you talk about the demonization of people, it's usually along ethno-religious lines as you're seeing that happening today. Ash, what say you then?
So I think when it comes to the origin of culture war, and just say I agree with everything Michael said, what I would add to it is that it's something which starts in media and then politicians take from it. So if you go all the way back to 1968, there was a sort of political chat show. And what they did was they took these two guys who were the sort of intellectual titans of their time, left-wing Gore Vidal and conservative William F. Buckley, and they sort of set them against each other and they would have these big Barneys. And then it was the 1968 Democrat Party National Convention in Chicago, and there were massive protests against the Vietnam War. It was a time of real radicalism. And these two men who always hated each other, right? The way in which people in media always can hate each other. These two men couldn't stand each other. It kicks off, and I think Gore Vidal calls William F. Buckley a proto-Nazi, and William F. Buckley says, I want to punch you in the face, you queer. And everyone thought that this was a terrible thing, a low point in American democracy and blah, blah, blah. But what ABC News found out was that the ratings went through the roof. And so I think that that's where you sort of see the beginning of this culture war practice, that you've got a political difference and you animate it by two people with wildly different identities just going at each other hammer and tongs. And so that's the sort of basis for what we see now when any issue, right, and it can be something really material and important like climate change, or it can be something as urgent as the genocide in Gaza. And you've got some producer somewhere going, what's the stupidest possible way we can debate this on telly? So climate change, this huge thing that's coming for all of us and our mamas, it's being debated through vegan sausage rolls. Or for the genocide in Gaza, it's being debated through the lens of, Bob Villain or kneecap, or should you say from the river to the sea. It's about reducing these things which are material and urgent into what can you say, what can you do, and different cultural practices. So I think that you can see that through line from 1968 until now, and as the distinction between media and politics collapses, because politicians are just glorified pundits. Like, I don't think that any prime minister should know who kneecap are, let alone have an opinion on them. Right? You should be too busy building high-speed rail. What do you mean you're talking about a punk band? But because the role of politicians has been so degraded, because they've outsourced so much of what they're meant to do to the market, they go, it's not my job to get involved in housing. It's not my job to get involved in wages. It's not my job to get involved in building stuff. That's for the markets to do. Instead, they just become talking heads like me. And I don't think I've got a dignified job, let alone do I want to see a prime minister doing it.
Well, I mean, 68 is a massive year around the world, and you see populism happening everywhere. The Prague Spring, you see the student protests in Paris, you see the U.S. Embassy in London, the protests in Grosvenor Square. Of course, you have the Tet Offensive. You've got a few assassinations in America. Martin Luther King Jr. You've got Bobby Kennedy, as you said, the chaos of the Chicago Democratic National Convention and all. But I'm fascinated by the fact that you focused on, and by the way, it's an excellent play called The Best of Enemies, the Buckley and Gore Vidal debate. One of my favorite ones was Buckley and James Baldwin, of course. But you mentioned it was on ABC, and I think that this is really instructive because ABC is one of America's three big networks, not so much anymore thanks to Netflix and streaming. But usually Buckley, this rather, how can I put this kindly, constipated gentleman physiologically and intellectually, would go ahead and usually be in the province of public television. The fact that this debate was on a major network in the United States, I think, is really fascinating, because it looked like these kinds of debates were now becoming commodified, and it was being injected into a broader audience. So I was wondering if you could comment on how that served as a catalyst in making the culture wars more pervasive.
Well, the thing is that, of course, all this happens in 1968, but you also need other ingredients, I think, for it to sort of have turbo boosters attached underneath it. So what also makes this kind of programming, absolutely explode is along comes cable, along comes 24-hour news, and it's really expensive to do high-quality news for 24 hours. So what are you going to fill the other 23 hours of the day with when you've got your 1 hour of quality news programming? All right, well, you get psychologically maladapted people like me to come on and argue with someone who's equally psychologically maladapted. It's cheap. Another thing is that, and I think both of us agree on this, is that when you've got the dismantling, the deliberate attacks on things like the trade union movement, heavy industry, working men's clubs, particularly here in the UK, that breaks down the machines which made class consciousness, because class is still the dividing line, but class is nothing without class consciousness. You need this sense of a shared worldview, this knowledge that we all have a shared experience to make the thing work, for us to go, all right, we form a class that's big enough and bad enough and ugly enough to take on those with all the power and the money. So you've got the neoliberal project, which is designed to break that down. Margaret Thatcher very famously said, economics are the method. The object is to change the soul. She wanted to change how people thought about themselves. And that means that this kind of programming has a feedback loop. It contributes to class being driven down in terms of its importance to people, because you're not seeing it reflected in the national conversation. And then it's also, the same way all media is, it's a mirror to yourself. So you learn what you look like and what the world is like by engaging with this media. So it goes around and around and around. And I think that's how you end up with this kind of current affairs programming, and then social media, where so much of it is identity-based argumentation, being the dominant mode through which we discuss politics today.
So Michael, here you have Ash describing certain milestones that are happening, which really is the dawn of Thatcherism. And similarly, you saw this happening in America with the rise of Reaganism around that same time. There's a recession. He's able to capitalize on it. It's a perfect storm. Take us through the political changes that you saw when it came to the diminution of labor at this point and the rise of Thatcher and the Tory party, and how that affected both the politics and the cultural engagements at the time.
Well, I was born in 1989, and I grew up like everybody of that generation, including Ash, of course.
Oh, it was not the same generation. I'm 3 years younger than you, Michael, please.
3 years, that meant a lot. Come on. I grew up in a world, and I think a lot of people of my generation grew up in a world where there were no political alternatives, where those alternatives had been wiped off the map. And I think a lot of what we talked about in terms of the culture war and so on, in terms of the sort of social media and the news cycle and so on, is obviously very, very true. I think really what we're dealing with, and what we're only just now beginning to grapple with, is the legacy of neoliberalism. And what does that really mean? What has it really done to all of our subjectivities? Like, how has a very warped and tangled kind of identity politics kind of made its way in and dominated our politics? But it's also, from the perspective of what I tend to write about, it's what did it do to the left? What did it do to the structures and the institutions of the left? And I think we're in this really interesting moment now, where on the one hand, all of our old institutions have been degraded by that process. Trade union density, down and down and down and down and down, and it still kind of wobbles, but it's not really going up very much. And miles behind where it was when Thatcher and Reagan and so on, very deliberately got hold of the state and used the state to crush the left. Why was it that a lot of constituencies voted for Brexit? Well, there are lots of complicated reasons, of course, but there was an outward hostility to migrants. Well, how did that get fed into people's consciousness? Well, it could be drip-fed into people's consciousness when the old bonds of trade union consciousness and the old bonds of the labour movement had been dissolved deliberately by the Thatcherite project. And so, on the one hand, we're in a situation where all of our institutions are very weak. And that goes for our political institutions as well. You know, there's no big communist party in Britain, there never really has been. But the Trotskyist left at an absolute low ebb. A lot of the kind of political, the organised left in Britain is at a very low ebb. But on the other hand, what neoliberalism has done is it has created mass disillusionment. And mass disillusionment. So we have millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people yearning for an alternative. And so I suppose we're in that moment. And which way it goes really is in our hands.
You write in the book that this generation of activists, those who are taking their role as culture warriors, that they have no history. And I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that. That's a really intriguing idea.
Yeah.
As a historian, I'm like, what the hell do you mean?
So chapter 2 of the book, which you can buy, is entitled A Generation Without a History. And we talk a lot about generation left, and I think this is very true in Britain, and it's true in the States as well. It's not just like my generation just happened to go like, oh, we're suddenly really left-wing now, because like we've got Twitter or something. No, we had a very specific experience of capitalism. We existed in an asset economy where our wages were going down, our public services were being hammered, and there was generational inequality. And generational politics became not an alternative to class politics, but became a means of expressing class politics, certainly in the 2010s, which is when I'm writing about. But yeah, generation without a history, I suppose, what I mean by this is that, well, we came of age politically in the 2010 student movement, which we can talk about that shared experience maybe, but people coming of age in a different moment, say the 1980s, you would have come of age into the left and you would have been surrounded by an ecosystem of organised groups, of a big trade union movement. Even if you didn't want to join an organised group, or even if you didn't join a trade union, you could plot yourself somewhere in that organised left. You were part of this big kind of breathing ecosystem of the left. To emerge into the left after the end of history, as we did, you know, after the end of when the alternatives were supposed to be dead, felt like emerging into a bit of a desert. We didn't know, we didn't have the tools in many ways, and we didn't have in many ways, the baggage, and that created a huge amount of creativity. So, you know, the smashing up of Millbank Tower, in the student movement, a very famous student riot that takes place in 2010, where the Conservative Party headquarters is smashed in and a fire extinguisher is thrown off the roof. And
wasn't me, Gov.
It wasn't me either. Many of these extraordinary things become possible, and this generation has an intense creativity because we didn't know we couldn't do it. Because had we been submerged in the organised left and in the traditions of the left, like previous generations were, if we'd had that historical connection, that historical memory, we wouldn't have been able to do the things we did in some ways. But at the same time, that lack of a means to integrate into that lack of sense of tradition, that lack of connection, that lack of sense of history, also means that when Corbynism comes along and when things start to happen that are more complicated and more capital P political, this generation of social movements is flipped on its head. And so, as well as having an intense creativity, we are very, very vulnerable to being blown along by winds. I would say of my generation, we were never in and against the Labour Party. We were first against the Labour Party, and then we were just in the Labour Party. And all of the anarchists who spent the first half of the decade telling me off for being in the Labour Party spent the second half of the decade telling me off for being too critical of its leadership. I'm not talking about you. So yeah, that's what I mean by the generation without a history. It's there's this political subject that emerges, and I think it emerges in multiple different places because we've obviously had a shared history of neoliberalism and a shared history of the death of left institutions, where, what does that mean politically? Who are these millennials? And how does that lack of history shape what they're capable of?
Go ahead,
I mean, just on that point about creativity, so you might not know this, but me and Michael have known each other for 15 years. True. And I first met him when I was 18, and I just started UCL, and I was, trying to like make friends and work out who I was and, you know, what kind of person did I want to be. And then suddenly the movement against the trebling of tuition fees kicks off, and then we occupy our university. And Michael, to me, seemed like you had all this political experience because I think you had like a student union presidency or something, right?
I was a sabbatical
Right, you're a
officer,
sabbatical officer. And it was really incredible watching you at that time because as events unfolded, and they always seemed to move so fast, like a snowball going down a mountain. There were times when you were leading and times when you were following. And watching you work out your relationship to this sort of swirling mass of people that were being mobilized, it was a really incredible trial by fire, like for me, politically. And out of that came all of these things, some of which lasted longer than others. So one, in terms of the creativity, was you had these just like random English literature students deciding that they were going to be the press officers. And so, you know, they were sat round a table and they'd be fielding calls to the BBC, and some of them were still trying to cram for their Chaucer exam. You know, you had this guy who we knew who developed an app for your phone so you could see where the police were at any given time to try and avoid being kettled by them.
He'd hacked into a police helicopter. Sorry, he hadn't hacked into a police helicopter.
You know, he officer. And then there were these guys, one was called Aaron Bastani and one was called James Butler, who decided through their experiences of watching us be lied about that the thing that we needed was a left-wing media organization. And some of these things lasted and some of these things didn't. And then there were a ton of people who were young at that time, who were our age at that time, who then ended up being really, really close to Jeremy Corbyn and the senior people around him. So I think that, you know, when you say we didn't know we couldn't do it, that was so true. And maybe the thing that we lacked in a way was having something before that which could be like a family, right? Like a family socializes you, teaches you what the world is like, gives you some structure for understanding things, but you've got to become independent of them if you want to be an adult and you want to do things for yourself. And I think that meant that when there were moments of real strategic difference, low ebb, demoralization, we had nothing to support us. We had very few people who could say, don't worry, this is how it's going to go, this is what it's going to be like. You had a couple of individuals who came by. I mean, the late David Graeber came by to talk to us about debt. He was very supportive to Novara Media. You had two very unknown backbenchers called John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn. They came by to show their support.
Random, really.
Yeah, randomly. And I remember like Jeremy carrying in this like really tatty plastic bag, and I was like, who the fuck is this guy? But like, I think they also almost wanted to respect our autonomy. So actually at those moments of low ebb, we didn't have those experienced hands like picking us up.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what's amazing about that student movement becomes an anti-austerity movement. It's wild, it's untamable, it's tactically very, very radical, it occupies stuff, it does direct action, and it becomes the anti-austerity movement, much, much bigger, much more significant in a way in creating the conditions for Corbyn. But again, a mass movement, a social movement, an industrial movement, very much from below. And I think what's incredible about that generation and the kind of story of our generation in a way is that we went from this very below politics, and then it's 2015, and then you flipped on your head, and we're into Corbynism, and it's like almost entirely the opposite. Like Corbynism, I fought hard for Corbyn to win, and I fought hard in those general elections. Very top-down politics. In the end, what that became was a very electoralist vehicle.
Well, I said to Owen Jones, it's like in With Now and I, when they're like, we've gone on holiday by mistake. Like, we captured the top of the Labour Party by mistake. We had no intention to do it, and then it just fucking happened.
Yeah. I remember I was talking to somebody who said it was either, I forget who it was, but either we're going to break it or we're going to take it over, and both are funny, so let's do it.
But was what happened to the left, in your mind, was it inevitable? I mean, if you could have found a way, looking back now, on where you could have disrupted that process, where would you have intervened?
I think that is such an enormous question. I think in a way you can't be too hard on the Corbyn project, and you can't be too hard on the left that we built. I mean, there was an enormous left alternative that came from nowhere, in a sense. I mean, it didn't come from nowhere if you were paying attention, but I think for a lot of our sort of media class, it came from nowhere. And 2017 was a very, very close election, and so it's important not to be too hard. But I do think that the kind of perennial problem that we have is this kind of tidal system, where either we're doing electoral politics or we're doing mass social and industrial movements. So you look at the kind of what happens towards the end of Corbynism, the two lowest years on record for strikes and days lost to strike action in British history, 2017, 2018, that's the high point of Corbynism. And so at the moment where we took control of the Labour Party, and you took, at the very moment where you needed a mass support base, you needed lots of activity and social movement and industrial activism as well, that kind of life force was switched off, and so it became this electoral thing. I think one of the basic problems with Corbynism was that it lacked democracy. And there was a very sad process in momentum, which, to be honest, if I go into it, is going to involve talking about a lot of committee meetings, and you can just read chapter 5.
I feel very triggered whenever I hear the word committee. I'm like, ugh.
Yeah. And basically what we need is to rediscover politics from below. But we need to rediscover politics from below that is better than what we had in the early 2010s, when we had mass movements with no political expression. We need a political vehicle. We need a political project that can win elections. But that has to be underpinned by a mass movement that's democratic and bottom-up.
I can only talk about the mistakes I made. And in some ways, the pandemic came at a really good time, because after the defeat of Corbynism, I was so bummed out I didn't want to fucking leave the house anyway. And this is how I would describe my mistakes. Both of them share something in common. Lyndon B. Johnson famously said, or a quote was attributed to him, "The first rule of politics is learn how to count." And somehow, at critical moments, I seem to always forget how to count. So one is when it came to identity politics. And one of the things that I really want to make clear is that I don't think identity politics is the same thing as anti-racism. And in fact, anti-racism sometimes requires letting go of some of the worst bits of identity politics. Because identity politics is all about competition and competitive victimhood, and who's more marginalized than who, and then that person sort of gets top billing. And automatically what happens is that you start building a politics around people who, by their very definition, are not that representative of most people. And it was also quite toxic sometimes, because then rather than being able to contest politics openly, I'd be like, "Oh, well, Michael, you would say that as a white man. And what are you supposed to say to that?" "No, I'm not." And that was a way of contesting things which, the CIA couldn't have invented it any better, even if they, had tried. It's a total psyop. And because we had these rules, which were okay in moderation and terrible in excess, it made us really weak in a more generalized sense. So we had this rule, which is whoever is speaking from their identity position, you have to believe them in what they say. So then it meant when the anti-Semitism crisis comes along, and you've got people saying, quite frankly, mad shit, like Jeremy wants to reopen Auschwitz, or let's take it to today and the genocide that's going on now, saying death to the IDF is anti-Semitic because they're an ethnic group and not, an army. We had to go, "Oh, we're going to take you so seriously, and there's no way for us to tell you, I'm sorry you feel that way, but it's an unreasonable worldview, and we can't really take too much of that on board," right? Because we'd internalized identity politics, it made us especially weak when it came to dealing with weaponized anti-Semitism. That's not to say that there weren't instances of anti-Semitism. Of course there were. There are also instances of misogyny, of Islamophobia, of anti-black racism, because a mass movement reflects society. And if you want me to sit here and promise that our movement's going to be totally free of racists and sexists, guess what? I can't. So we created a totally unreasonable standard. It made us really, really vulnerable to weaponized anti-Semitism. And I think that I was a part of it, and that was my mistake. And now that I'm older and uglier, I feel like I've learned from it. The second thing where the rule is learn how to count is I voted Remain in 2016 because I care a lot about the condition of migrants. And the reason why is because what happens to your migrant worker today happens to your British worker tomorrow. right? That's a rule as true as gold. But then when the Conservative Party decided to create an impasse, and they said, right, it's either going to be the hardest possible Brexit or Remain, I abandoned too quickly the middle position, which is what if there was a soft Brexit that could bring both parties together, and I chose the side which had the number 48 attached to it rather than 52. And again, it was a mistake that was honestly come by, but the reason why I think I made it is because I'm a graduate, I was raised in London, I live in London, if I leave London I get a nosebleed. I was surrounded by people who are just like me. And it allowed me the fantasy, and there was also loads of polling that was commissioned in order to paint this picture as well. It allowed me the fantasy of there are more people like me than aren't. And I think that was a mistake that I would like to think that I've learned from. So if we had our time again, I would just make different mistakes.
I feel like we need to have a polite row about Brexit.
You're now playing couples therapist.
Should I move?
No, it's fine. As one of the people who led the campaign to get Labour to adopt a second referendum position, I feel like I should also speak. So I suppose I do think that some of what we did towards the end, in terms of trying to get Labour to adopt an explicitly Remain position, 2019 conference and after, was not exactly wrong, but a complete waste of time. I think it had already been lost long in advance of that. But I do think that there's an unexamined, I think, obviously I've read your book and I know that you've changed your mind on this. I haven't. Broadly, I think we did make some mistakes, but I haven't. I think that underlying that is an assumption that Labour lost the 2019 election because we took a second referendum position, because we took an anti-Brexit position. We didn't take an anti-Brexit position. And I don't think that's true. We lost 2 million votes on either side, and that was about 2 million votes to the Brexit Party and to the Tories. We lost about 2 million votes to the Liberal Democrats and to the Greens. And that was with a second referendum policy. So I think if we hadn't gone that far, I think we hadn't taken that position, you'd have polled sub 30. And I think you would have ended up with a worse result. That is not to say that the way that that polarisation wasn't very, very damaging for us. Of course it was. But I also think it's wrong to say, to over-egg how much agency we had in that polarisation. Like, the Brexit project was always going to fall apart. You could vote for Brexit if you were somebody who wanted to control immigration and who wanted a social democratic programme. You could also vote for Brexit if you were a libertarian who wanted open borders and you were a libertarian capitalist. Totally incoherent positions put together for the Brexit referendum. As time went on, as the concept of Brexit that 52% of people voted for became the solid deal that we would actually leave with, of course that coalition was going to unwind, disentangle. It wasn't going to work out anymore. And you were going to get this polarisation between Leave and Remain again. And I think the mistake, for me, I don't think the problem was us in London and Remainers, or the left taking too pro-Remainer stance. Look, fundamentally, the Labour leadership chose to have an ambiguous position on Brexit. That was a huge problem.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
And I don't mean this in a bitchy way, I promise. But when you were sitting in meetings with like Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell, did you not think maybe these guys don't have my best interests as a socialist at heart?
I never sat in a room with Peter Mandelson.
But
or
what I
Alistair
mean
Campbell.
is when you find yourself on the same side, and these guys really, really, really drove the polarisation of Brexit within the Labour Party, right? They properly did. You know, as soon as Jeremy Corbyn gets elected, Peter Mandelson comes out of a coffin like Nosferatu. But like when you see yourself on that side, the same way as you know, if you're a left-wing Brexiteer and you see yourself on the same side as Nigel Farage, you may want to have some self-reflection. But was there not a self-reflection of like, these guys want to kill our project? Yeah,
they're like, a lot of them are literal war criminals. I have absolutely no time for any of them. But the problem is with that bit of the political class is that they are totally unprincipled and unscrupulous and will do whatever it is that's in their political interests. And if you walk around writing a plus where they write a minus and a minus where they write a plus, you will end up creating a mirror image of their own, of whatever they're doing. We set up Another Europe is Possible, which is the group that I led. Not led, I was a part of, I worked for it. because we wanted an explicitly left-wing, independent left-wing anti-Brexit campaign. We were rooted in Momentum, we were rooted in the Green Party. We made an anti-establishment, pro-migrant case for Remain. And we knew that we had to do that because, like, you know, I don't know, I remember picking up leaflets towards the end of the Brexit campaign being like, oh my God, what is this, like, vote Remain because house prices will go down if you don't. Says Richard Branson, like George Osborne, like Darth Maul, not even the A-list Sith Lord. Like, and so we did build, you had to have an independent politics in that moment. And that is what we did. Look, I would not have, in the end, I think that Labour didn't have to be the party of Remain to win that election. It had to be the party of Remainers. It had to be able to bring the Remain vote, the vast majority of the Remain vote with it. It could have done that with a soft Brexit position. It could have done that with a second referendum position. But it had to pick that position early, and it had to fight for it. And the problem was that no matter how hard we pushed the leadership to do one of those things, and we did campaign for a soft Brexit position to begin with, after the referendum, the leadership did not want to do that. It wanted to stick to a harder Brexit position, and that wasn't tenable, and they ended up doing handbrake turns between different positions that didn't make sense.
All right.
Sorry, we're
Couples
relitigating
therapy.
things here.
No. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to open this up to you, the audience. Couples therapists can talk to them at the book signing. But what I'd like to do, though, is we should have a roving mic. 2 requests from you. One is if you could keep your remarks succinct, and the other is if you could keep your remarks ending with a question mark, not a full stop or an exclamation point. So let's go here, and here in the first round, and then we'll come to you in the back in a second. Okay.
I want to hear from the girls as well, what the girls saying.
Hi, just listening to you, do you still think that Labour is the only vehicle for a left future, or do you actually think alternative configurations of political parties and political forces are necessary? That's a question mark.
Why don't we do 3 in, collectively here, and then we're going to go to the back, and hopefully ladies also to go ahead and ask questions as well. So I think there was one here, the gentleman here, and then there's the gentleman in the baseball cap.
You've argued effectively of how the establishment uses identity politics to divide the working class. However, I feel there's a lack of acknowledgement on the left about the tension that exists between different protected characteristics. So for example, on one hand, you've got the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. On the other hand, you've got the APPG definition of Islamophobia. There's a tension there. And similarly, you can apply that to other protected characteristics such as gender, sex, religion, and belief. So in order to provide that, to have that coalition between the different marginalized groups within the working class, what are your thoughts about dealing with them conflicts between these protected characteristics and the tensions that exist?
Thank you. And one over here with the cap. Right there. Yep.
Hi. My question is, just off of something Ash mentioned, which was, the left is sort of held to a higher standard, and do we think the left should punch a bit more, or should we focus more on the values such as what we saw in the New York leadership with Zohran Mamdani, where he showed more of a compassion nature of what the left can be? Is that something that we should focus on?
Thank you. Okay, in either order or both?
All right, so first on Zohran Mamdani. Not every candidate's going to have his dimples, all right? Hate to break it to you. But what a phenomenally clever campaigner. I live thousands of miles away from him, and I know that his 3 promises are rent controls, free bus travel, and universal childcare. And he picked the fights he really wanted to have, but he also had a strategy for the attacks that were coming his way. So from very early on, he got Jewish progressives who are against the occupation, who are, opponents of Netanyahu on board to also help him communicate with, a cohort of people that AIPAC are pouring millions and millions of dollars into trying to terrify. All right? So I think that he played it really, really smart. His marquee promises are nothing to do with identity, right? They are material, economic promises. And when you compare him to, say, Bill de Blasio, who made ending stop and frisk one of his, core promises, actually there is much less focus on racialized and racist policing by a more radical candidate of color than there was by Bill de Blasio, right? And why? Because he's a smart guy. I think he understands that he's got to, build this sort of multi-ethnic coalition. A second thing on identity politics. I was against the IHRA, and I was also against the APPG definition of Islamophobia. Because, one, you cannot define your way out of racism. It is not an HR issue, it's an issue of power. And two, I don't think that casting certain things as unsayable is good either. Nearly half, or perhaps over half, of the IHRA definitions concern what you can or can't say about the state of Israel. Why is that? All right? So I think that when, various Muslim groups try to be like, oh, well, we'll do the same thing, there is nothing which is comparable. There is nothing which is comparable to trying to provide cover for, a genocidal ethno-state, quite frankly. So I always thought that was a waste of time. How do you deal with tensions? Well, it has to be a real negotiation. And that's why it can't be about, well, my identity trumps your identity. And I'm going to give you a very quick example before I kick over to you, which is when Fred Hampton, who was a leader within the Black Panther Party, did this thing called the Rainbow Coalition, working with the Puerto Rican Young Lords and the Young Patriots, who were basically poor white people from Appalachia. The Young Patriots had, at that time, as their symbol, the Confederate flag. No good, very bad, pro-slavery, do not like. In our current circumstances, I think we would go, we can't work with you until you ditch the flag. And then the whole thing breaks down before you do anything. Instead, they said no. We've got shared enemies, which is American capitalism, corporate power, and the fact that, because the Vietnam War was going on, poor whites and poor blacks are being drafted to be cannon fodder. And then out of respect for the Black Panthers, and because they've got the shared experience of organizing together, the Young Patriots voluntarily gave up the flag. So how do you deal with tensions? How do you deal with conflicts? You actually don't do it by saying we're not going to work together until we resolve these conflicts. We go, we're going to work together and we're going to resolve the conflicts in so doing. That's my take.
Yeah. I'll start with the one about Labour. I was a member of the Labour Party for 13 years, and 2 weeks ago I left and joined the Greens. I think that it is no longer sustainable to try to funnel people into the Labour Party. I think that for two reasons. One, because of what the Labour Party is doing in government. I think it is a profoundly disorientating thing to do. The problem with being on the Labour left is that you have to encourage people to join the Labour Party and vote for the Labour Party. And I think that's just a very disorientating thing to do, to go around knocking on doors saying, vote for these bastards. And I don't say that about everybody in the Labour Party. I have many friends in the Labour Party, and I have an enormous amount of respect for many of the Labour left MPs. And many trade unions, for instance, are still affiliated. That's for good reason in many cases. But for me, we are at a moment where there are millions and millions and millions of people who want and demand an alternative. Their expectations were raised by Corbynism. They know what it's like to be able to vote for a party that could get into government that you can actually believe in. And they are not going to settle for being told to tactically vote for David Lammy. And they are not going to be told, and if we're serious about being reform, and if we're serious about building an alternative to those politics, as well as, frankly, to the right-wing authoritarian politics of this government, we are going to need alternative vehicles. For me, the Green Party offers a vehicle that is very democratic, and that with Zach Polanski's leadership bid, I think we do have an opportunity to turn it around and turn it into a left party that just as much resembles left parties as it does Green parties. But for me, the important thing is whether it's that, or whether it's whatever alternative is built, other alternatives are built on the left, and it's not clear yet what will emerge there. The vital thing is that we work together. The absolutely vital thing is that there is a pact between all of these parts of the left. And I would say that includes the Labour left, by the way. So I suppose that's my take on that. I think that the Labour Party, and there are all sorts of other good arguments why the Labour Party isn't that vehicle for change. Lots of Ralph Miliband, if you want to read that. and because it is basically a machine that makes people crap. You put people into the Labour Party and they come out crap. Because of all of the various proximities to the state, because the political culture, the culture of self-promotion and the culture of careerism that exists in that party. So that's my take on the Labour Party. It's quite a big change. It feels like jumping off a cliff, but here we go. Let's do it. I think we can. I think one of the recurring issues, sorry, I don't want to go on and on, but one of the recurring issues I think we have, and one of the big problems that we have when dealing with identity politics within our own movements, and I neither mean that in a pejorative way nor in a non-pejorative way. I mean the sort of broad sphere of things is that we seek procedural answers to political problems. And I think that's exactly what Ash is hitting on. That, the thing that you're supposed to say whenever anyone says anything racist is, expel them, get rid of them now. And actually, there's going to be racism in our movements, there's going to be sexism in our movements. And obviously there are lines that you can't cross and that you do have to get rid of people for. But actually what we need is a politics that is capable of collective understanding, that's capable of being kind to one another, and that's capable of making people better, as well as just simply seeking these procedural, top-down mechanisms.
People are messy.
Yeah.
People are so messy. My grandma had a form of homophobia, which I've never heard from anyone else, which was that she loved gay men, thought they were great, but she thought that all lesbians were racist, apart from her lifelong friend Angie, and then my friend Ellen from uni. People are messy.
I think that's called surgical homophobia.
I don't know where she got it from.
I do apologize that we are out of time, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to, I'm sure, a plethora of questions. I'm sure that if you attend the book signing after this, you should have an opportunity to go ahead and engage with both Michael and Ash. The books are, Michael, this is only the beginning, The Making of a New Left from Anti-Austerity to the Fall of Corbyn. Ash's book is Minority Rule, Adventures in the Culture War. Please join me in thanking both Ash Sarkar and Michael Chessum.